Welcome to the Crime and COVID webinar, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to all participants around the world. I hope that you and your families are all safe and well, and that you are managing to stay positive and in good spirits in these unprecedented and unsettling times. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Dimitris Iouvas. I'm a professor of criminal law, in particular financial criminal law and anti-corruption law at Pandion University of Athens, and also a research fellow at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies of the University of London. I am delighted to host this fascinating webinar. A big thanks goes to the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies of the University of London for making this happen. In particular, to the University of London event manager, Mrs. Dali Sarkos, and my good colleague, reader in law, Dr. Colin King, at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies. I would also like to thank the British European Law Association, BEU Law, for co-organizing today's event. Allow me a few very brief words to set the scene and lay out some basic housekeeping rules. Then I will introduce the panel and we'll get things underway. A very quick Zoom tip from me to anyone attending. If you want the person speaking, like myself right now, to go full screen and the other speakers in small boxes down the right of your screen, just click on the speaker box window. Today's discussion focuses on something specific but critical as we try to navigate our way throughout the crisis, namely the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on organized crime, financial crime, and corruption, and also the related risks and challenges for criminal policymakers, law enforcement, and corporations alike. The COVID-19 threat is causing deaths all around the world, putting lives at risk and threatening the stability of our economies, our societies, and our democracies as well. Developing countries are likely to be hit the hardest. It is forcing governments to take quick decisions to implement drastic measures of emergency to close down national borders, restrict movement of persons and business activity. All this in order to protect the communities and limit the economic fallout of the pandemic. The unprecedented measures taken represent a stress test for public health management systems, for economies, societies, but also for the rule of law and for democracy. It will come as no surprise to anyone watching the webinar that this pandemic crisis has led criminals to adjust their modus operandi and to adapt new virtual web-based ways of doing criminal business. So the crisis is posing increased risks for law enforcement agencies, and there is a high risk of organized crime, financial crime, and corruption. Today, we aim to identify and address the increased challenges, recognize what has changed in the past few months, think of how government and businesses need to address these risks, and try to identify the challenges for the rule of law and businesses, integrity, and democracy at the very end. We have a really superb panel representing all the different crimes and perspectives that I just addressed. Allow me a little bit of housekeeping, then I'll stop talking. The webinar will have a duration of 60 to 90 minutes. Please get involved for all attendees. Submit your thoughts and questions via the chat box which is available at the bottom of your screen. Please try to keep your questions short so that I can, as the webinar moderator, navigate through them more easily. Do mention your full name, and if you wish, your country and profession or academic capacity. Do keep your comments and questions coming throughout the discussion, throughout the presentations. We will address as many questions and points as possible during the Q&A session, which will take place after the three speakers have finished their presentations. We will dedicate approximately 20 minutes for this Q&A session. Please make sure that you choose in the chat box if you want your comment or question to be seen by all attendees or addressed just to myself as the host for me to forward to the respective speaker. Finally, I would like to mention that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies website and the BU Law YouTube channel in due time. So allow me to introduce our speakers in the sequence that they will take the floor. First of all, we've got with us today Mr. Ilias Hadjis, who is Chief of the Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling Section of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, headquartered in Vienna, Austria. Then we have Lucia Bird, Senior Analyst at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. This is a civil society organization, an NGO, and also a network of experts headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. And we've got also Gemma Iolfi. She's Head of Compliance, Corporate Governance and Collective Action at the Basel Institute on Governance, located in Switzerland. As you can see, we have world-leading experts contributing and all the important perspectives covered. That is enough from me now. Let me give the virtual floor to our first speaker today, Mr. Ilias Hadjis. Ilias, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dimitri. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And let me try to see if I can bring up my presentation. I hope you can all see it. Now, I would say, I think it would be an understatement to say that COVID, the pandemic, found us all unprepared. And it found us unprepared on many aspects, including on crime prevention. When the pandemic came, it came too fast and it hit too hard. The problem is that, examples that we have from the past of similar pandemics, of natural disasters, or other global crises have not been researched enough as far as the implications of crime are concerned. For example, we have almost nothing on the impact of the 2003 SARS epidemic in Asia on trafficking persons. We have very little on the 2004 tsunami in Southeast Asia, and a little bit more on the 2008 financial crisis and its impact on trafficking persons. And actually, UNODC has done a quite interesting study that I will bring up later on, because I think it has some interesting elements that may be relevant to the situation today. The second point that I want to make is that it's too early to make definite conclusions, to draw definite conclusions on the impact of the pandemic. We're still collecting the data. Nevertheless, we know enough of the crime, how it manifests itself, how the criminal networks work, and we do need to be prepared to take measures to address in early signs of a deterioration of the situation with regard to trafficking in persons, or to be prepared for difficult situations that may follow after the pandemic is over. An additional remark that I think is quite important to note is that the pandemic does not hit everyone at the same time with the same force. So it has different levels of intensity in the different geographic regions, and when it starts in one region, it finishes in another. So even though we're able to draw conclusions or to draw some examples, if you like, or some good practices from what has countries gone through, we're not able to take measures at the same time for everyone. So these are some parameters that I think are quite important to have in mind when we're discussing trafficking in persons. Now, let me see if I can, okay. What is trafficking in persons? First, I would like to a little bit set the frame of the discussion. Now, it is widely recognized as among humanity's worst form of exploitation. As a crime, it was established in 2000 when the United Nations Transnational Organized Crime Convention and its associated protocol against trafficking in persons were signed in Palermo. The protocol actually criminalizes and provides the first definition, the international definition and the widely accepted international definition of trafficking in persons. It's quite important to note that the protocol has almost universal endorsement. It has more than 100, it has 175 states parties out of 197 members of the United Nations. So less than 20 countries to ratify and it will become universally applicable. This is extremely important because first, it's only a few years since it was adopted, it's less than 20 years. Second, because it does provide a framework within which countries can cooperate with each other by defining the crimes in the same manner. Now, some aspects of the crime, I will not go into the definition because it's too complex legally and we may go back to it later on when the Q&A time comes. But I would like to focus a little bit more on the manifestations of the crime and how does it portray itself, how do we see it in our everyday life. And the best way to define it is through the types of exploitation that it includes. In the protocol, it includes certain types of exploitation, such as prostitution of others, sexual exploitation, slavery, removal of organs. The list, though, is open-ended, which means that countries can add new types of exploitation in the definition of human trafficking. And this has happened. So the definition itself is evolving and it's actually becoming more and more complex, but also at the same time more and more relevant to the needs of the different regions and different countries. Just to give you an example, many countries report types of exploitation such as forced begging, domestic servitude, forced marriages, production of pornography, and so on and so forth. Child soldiers, especially in Africa, and so on and so forth. Now, another important element is the gender aspect of the crime. Majority of victims are women and girls, more than 70% of the overall victims. Now, this is consistently the result of our data, of our research for more than 15 years. So there's definitely a gender aspect to the crime. What I would like you to know is also that children and young girls are also 1 in 3 victims globally. This is a remarkable number if you think about the millions of victims that exist out there. The picture is different when you're looking globally and when you're looking regionally. And this has an importance because as COVID has a regional aspect and from region to region it differs, its intensity differs, I think it's important to look at also at the different aspects of trafficking in persons regionally. So for example, in Africa, we have the largest majority of victims are children. Sexual exploitation is the predominant form of trafficking globally, with forced labor coming as the second. Both of them make up more than 90% of the exploitation reported to us. However, in different regions, you have different types of exploitation and different gender aspects. Central Asia, it's mostly forced labor and men. In Europe and North America, it's women for sexual exploitation. As I said, in Africa, it's mostly children in different forms of exploitation, from child soldiers to begging to domestic servitude and others. Now, going to COVID. When COVID came, it really, as I said, hit hard, and it hit unexpectedly. Some of the impact of COVID, on trafficking victims, and I would categorize here 3 groups of individuals that are of interest to our discussion. First are the victims that have been identified and which have been within the support of social services, the victims that are still in captivity, so still in the hands of the organized crime, and third, also the responders, the law enforcement, the justice system, and what has been the impact on them. Now, for the victims that have been saved, that have survived, and are in the hands in the shelters of the social services. These support services have been suspended or at best reduced or turned online wherever possible. But let's not forget that not all victims of human trafficking have the capacity to have access to these services. There is a lack of access to healthcare for especially undocumented migrants, which are extremely vulnerable to trafficking in persons. Access to justice itself is hindered. You cannot file petitions in court, in writing. Deadlines for the submission of legal documents may expire without people being able to submit the documents. In some cases, victims are identified through a court process in many countries. So if these court processes are delayed or stalled, then the recognition of the victim's rights may be delayed with significant implications. Children are at highest risk. Schools are closed. For many children, schools are also not only education, but it's also shelter and nourishment. What happens to these children? There is the impact on confinement measures on heavily traumatized people like the victims. If you have been in captivity for sometimes years, the fact that you have to stay indoors for an undetermined at the beginning length of time can have a significant impact on your well-being. Law enforcement, they need to divert resources. They need to go to be out there in the streets to enforce the pandemic measures. Where are these resources taken from? They're mostly taken from frontline officers. And in general, we do detect that even though crime rates, as we knew them, seem to be stable, if not reduced during the pandemic, we have seen them going either further underground or even going online. So crime has not stopped during the pandemic. But law enforcement had to divert resources to other types of functions. And we have been talking to a number of police officers who have expressed a lot of frustration about the fact that they had to do other things that they usually work during this period. International cooperation mechanisms have basically frozen. You cannot send now a rogatory letter. You cannot send a formal letter from one government to another for international cooperation. Borders are closed, so normal liaison officers meeting between countries that share the same borders have stopped. This has significant implications for people that may need to, for victims of human trafficking, that may need to be repatriated. And we had to intervene in a particular case in Southeast Asia where the borders closed while the victims were about to be repatriated after years of exploitation and be reunited with their families. And the host country, actually, in the host country, their residence permits have expired and they had no work permit. So they were basically in a limbo situation. It was really traumatic, and we had to help by intervening and discussing and helping the two authorities work out a modality to repatriate these victims. For those still in captivity, for those still in the hands of the traffickers, there's a lot of concern there about the levels, especially of violence and abuse in situations of confinement. The traffickers cannot use the victims for making profit, so there's serious concerns about their well-being and how they are basically even surviving during this period. We do receive a number of indications that actually have been quite public. Also in the UK and in Austria, they had, for example, an increased number of reports of domestic abuse during this period, and domestic abuse is an indication of the level of violence in confinement for trafficking persons, because you have people also serving in domestic households while they've been trafficked. So, and in Austria, the numbers have been more than 50%, and I think in the UK, one of the main NGOs reported more than 700% of increase in the number of reported cases via hotline in the first weeks of the pandemic. So violence and abuse and used against trafficking victims is a serious concern. Now, some forms of exploitation are expected to increase, and this especially refers to online sexual exploitation. And I think Lucia will talk more about it later on, especially for children. You have seen maybe a report by Europol recently that actually referred to an increased number of reported cases of of an increased number, I'm sorry, just to be correct, an increased number of countries reporting abusive material being sought on the internet during this period. The third point is that victims will become less visible. You cannot go out there, they cannot see people, they cannot even seek help that sometimes they try to do by escaping captivity and trying to find a law enforcement officer or a person in the street to ask for help. This cannot happen right now. And also, let's not forget that in a number of countries, the police uses a really heavy-handed approach on how they're treating those that seem to have violated confinement rules. So in many cases, victims may actually be afraid to approach police officers during this period of crisis to us to seek help. And again, we go to the issue of resources and the fact that a lot of resources have to be diverted to COVID-related tasks. Now, what are the long-term implications of this situation? First of all, the impact of the pandemic on the healthcare systems and the social services is of increasing concern. How many of these countries will come out after this pandemic and how much support they will be able to offer or continue to offer to vulnerable groups such as victims of human trafficking is still in doubt. If you combine this with the introvert national responses that we see in a number of cases where many countries look first for their own citizens against other groups of people that are actually extremely vulnerable, such as migrant populations, the two of them in combination are quite concerning. Now, there are also fears about people fleeing poverty and the pandemic. There are fears of aggravated smuggling because they will need to go through much more thorough border control measures to be able to reach a safe place or a place where they can work. And we have actually published a report last week, which you may have seen, on the smuggling side of the crime, where we saw that numbers, for example, of smuggled people from Libya to Europe have not stopped during the height of the pandemic in Italy. And there are a lot of questions about it. The war in Libya was there also before the pandemic. Why people were not afraid? Could it be because also law enforcement had to divert resources to other tasks? So, boats could not be manned at the normal ratio of people, or could not have the same number of patrols out of the seas. So there's a lot of issues, and I think it's a quite interesting point that we have to look at, when this thing is over. Finally, is the economic downturn. Trafficking in persons is a crime of exploitation. And the fewer the jobs, the worse the unemployment, the worse the working condition, the more chances that people maybe, end up being trafficked to make a living. We have some indications that we can maybe not draw conclusions, but look at them as a comparative, following the 2008-2010 global financial crisis. And there we saw that the numbers of trafficking victims increased in the countries that had slower recovery and that the economic crisis hit them hard. And here you see a chart, for example, of Bulgarian victims in the Netherlands during the time of the crisis. You can see also the unemployment rates in Bulgaria and how these two lines kind of correlate. We have similar indications from other countries, including Hungary, for example, that we have taken a look during the same period. Now, what do we do? As an office, first of all, one of our main tasks is to try to understand better the situation. And it's really not easy and it's extremely complex. We're working a lot with other agencies. We did publish 2 reports, one a brief one, another one more thorough. And we're doing also others which are in the pipeline, also regional reports to find out what is the effect of the pandemic on trafficking in persons. We're working a lot to facilitate cross-border cooperation. This is a must in the current circumstances. And we're also helping where we can in addressing emergency needs in basic protective equipment. This is not a normal job. We wouldn't do that on a regular day. But we had countries that their witness protection units that were working very closely with them came and asked us for help in getting masks and other equipment so they're able to continue interacting with victims. And we did find a way to respond to this need. Again, this is not our normal job, but we have to really address what the countries need first and as best as we can. We're also working with the authorities in addressing their first, sometimes the unintended results of the measures to address the pandemic. In Panama, for example, there is one of the measures is that women and men can go out in different days of the week. So men can go Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Women can go Tuesday, Thursdays, Fridays, which means that women trafficking victims could not meet in person their psychological counselors for very many days. So we had our own staff, intervening with the authorities to facilitate this type of consultation, which are crucial for heavily traumatized people, because some of these sessions had to be with physical presence and not online. We work a lot with the other agencies. We work a lot with the other UNH. We work a lot with UNHCR. We work a lot with IOM. For example, in working, especially in Latin America right now, there's a lot of concern about the 5 million Venezuelans abroad, and there are numbers of trafficking victims among them. Some of them are trying to return home as best as they can because they are not welcome in where they were, or they think that maybe going back it would be safer, as Venezuela has not been, at least until now, as severely hit as the other countries. So we are working with the other agencies to basically establish a network of prosecutors that can coordinate case of trafficking among this type of vulnerable populations, migrants basically, on the move, and refugees. We have a number of recommendations for actions and action for governments, mostly. We do think that governments should not forget the most vulnerable. Trafficking in persons is a crime that is very high on everybody's agenda. And it's also a crime that really deserves the attention even at these times. We do understand that we are, as everybody, is very appreciative of the efforts to save lives, and this is a priority. But doing this, we can always make sure that others, as we say in the UN, are not left behind, and nobody's left behind. So I would like to leave it here for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Elias. It is really striking, as you just mentioned, that although borders, national borders, seems to be closed down, trans-border trafficking has not stopped. As you just mentioned, like people being trafficked from Libya to Europe and so on. And I have put down on paper a few points. Resources have gone down in terms of law enforcement. It is the visibility of victims is very problematic in these times, and also there are barriers to international cooperation, which is key to fighting trans-border, transnational trafficking in persons. I think the word transnational and trans-border is also at the very heart of Lucia's presentation. You have also mentioned, Elias, sexual exploitation of women and children, and cybercrime is very closely linked with sexual exploitation. Having said that, I would like to give the virtual floor to Lucia to present her thoughts on cybercrime, and since she's also an expert on trafficking and migrant smuggling, maybe she would also like to say a few words to make this nexus better understandable for our attendees. So thank you very much, Elias. Lucia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So if I can just... I will just share my screen. Right. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much, Elias, for that. Very interesting. If also...
Lucia, allow me to say a few words about yourself, as I did with Elias. So I did forget this. So Lucia, for anyone who doesn't know her, so no expert in organized crime, is a senior analyst at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. She works across a range of organized crime types, including drugs trafficking, and as I just mentioned, human smuggling and human trafficking. But of course, today she will focus on cybercrime issues. Lucia has focused particularly on how organized crime has exploited digital tools to enhance their operations. In addition to researching and analyzing cybercrime trends, Lucia is a practicing lawyer in the data protection and cyberspace law field. Previously, Lucia has worked as a legal and policy advisor to the governments of Ghana and Pakistan. I think it is important for our attendees to know your professional background. So sorry for the interruption. Lucia, you have the word.
Not at all. Thank you very much. And thank you for the introduction. So as Dimitri said, I'll be focusing on cybercrime and the impact of COVID on cybercrime in this presentation. However, we at the Global Initiative have also been tracking the impacts on human smuggling and human trafficking, and I look forward to discussion later in the Q&A session. So cybercrime. As Elias said, we're seeing that some types of crime are experiencing perhaps a temporary lull, or we're seeing slightly less. For example, national law enforcement agencies tend to be tracking a decrease in lots of forms of petty crime. But with cybercrime, in general, we believe that there is an increase. So Europol have stated that the impact of the COVID pandemic on cybercrime has been the most visible and striking compared to other criminal activities. And I'd like to explore why. In brief, it's because the COVID pandemic has given cybercriminals a perhaps unprecedented opportunity due to both the public fear that it causes, but also the newfound vulnerabilities in company systems from our lockdown and work from home measures. So if we look first at phishing and ransomware, so firstly, these are two types of cyber-dependent crimes. These are crimes that can only be committed through the use of a computer, as a contrast to cyber-enabled crimes, which can be increased in their reach or their scale through the use of a computer or networks or systems. So if we look first at phishing, in phishing emails, the sender assumes a fake identity to trick the victim into sharing confidential information. Usually that's done by pretending to offer something that the victim wants. Now, in the context of COVID, criminals are exploiting that need for more information about the pandemic, about the health impacts, about how they can be mitigated, to launch phishing attacks on their victims. In light of this, we've seen a significant increase in phishing attacks. Now, this is not unprecedented. We've seen similar spikes in phishing attacks with other health emergencies, such as SARS or Ebola, or even non-health crises, but events of great interest, so Brexit, the Olympic Games, the 2020 Australian bushfires. All of these served as backdrops for spikes in phishing attacks. So anything which is in the public interest offers this kind of opportunity, but COVID is perhaps unprecedentedly global. And in the current crisis, many of these phishing scams are using logos of the, for example, World Health Organization, or they're faking relief fund forms, which are aiming to support the unemployed by their governments. So they're really going in to target elements that the victims are really desperate for more information about. And phishing emails can be easily customized to fit the local context. So it is common for there to be references to either institutions that the victim is likely to be familiar with, such as the WHO, or even local place names. So, for example, in one of the earliest COVID-related phishing attacks that we saw, which occurred in late January, which targeted disabled individuals pretending to be a healthcare provider, sharing more information about COVID and its health impacts. And the email was, of course, written in Japanese, but the form of the language was tailored to look as if the authors were from the same area as the recipients, to try and generate that trust. And phishing is expected to increase. Now, finally, with phishing, this is a really low-tech form of cybercrime. You can buy a phishing kit online for as little as $50. There are currently deals on the dark net, buy one, get one free. So this is not high-tech cybercrime. You really need very limited abilities to launch these kind of attacks. So moving to ransomware. In ransomware attacks, it's a type of malicious software which criminals use to take the files on a device hostage by encrypting the data and then refusing access until a ransom is paid. Usually the ransom is demanded in Bitcoin or some other form of cryptocurrency, which is extremely difficult for law enforcement to trace. Now, phishing and ransomware are linked because in order to launch the ransomware attack, the perpetrator needs to be able to gain access to that device or that system. And in many cases, the perpetrator will use a phishing attempt to lure the victim into clicking on a malicious link or opening a document, and from there then deploy the malicious software across the device. And what this means is that companies that have their employees working from home are to some extent as vulnerable as the weakest link in their system. And I'll discuss this a little bit more later. Now, ransomware has been an extremely prominent form of cybercrime in the last few years in the EU and more broadly. And we believe it will remain key both during and after the pandemic. We've already seen a number of ransomware attacks within the COVID kind of response period. Now, usually organizations that are very sensitive to downtime are preferred targets for ransomware criminals because they have greater urgency in paying that ransom. They cannot afford not to access their systems for a set period of time. So typically this might include manufacturing enterprises, but also hospitals. And it is these health systems that are perhaps the ones that we've seen the greatest shift in the way that they're being attacked. And the pandemic is really multiplying the damage that ransomware attacks can cause to certain institutions. And we've seen that criminals, cyber criminals, are extremely sensitive to this, and they're shaping the attacks to focus in on those institutions who can least afford for their systems to be down. In terms of outlook, we expect that ransomware attacks are going to continue to grow. In terms of the ransomware attacks that are being reported to international and national law enforcement agencies, the majority are related to known ransomware families, which suggests that they are being deployed by existing networks. But there is some evidence that these networks are recruiting. And we will also expect networks that perhaps are not experienced ransomware deployers to try and use this type of crime in this period. However, it's a little bit more complex than phishing attacks, and therefore we expect some ransomware attacks to fail because they are being deployed by less experienced networks. Now, I mentioned that healthcare systems are perhaps a particularly different form of target that we are currently seeing in the COVID pandemic. As you can see from this chart here, starting as early as January and going onwards, we have seen that a significant portion of cybercrime is related to COVID. So we saw a spike in domain names being linked to COVID, the virus, the pandemic, COVID-19. Many of those are genuine, but we know that many of those have been used as the sites to launch malicious attacks. And one of the ways that we have seen cybercriminals adapt to COVID is by increasingly targeting healthcare institutions with ransomware attacks. Now, it's not that healthcare institutions have never been the target of ransomware attacks, but typically they have been collateral damage rather than the target. So, for example, the WannaCry attack in 2017, which heavily impacted the UK National Health Service, or NotPayer, also in 2017, which did affect certain healthcare institutions. These were collateral because of the fast-moving pace of the ransomware attack. There was little evidence to suggest that the healthcare systems themselves were the target. this is changing in the COVID pandemic. To take the University Hospital of Brno in the Czech Republic, which was attacked by a ransomware attack in the second week of March. This was clearly a targeted ransomware attack. It significantly disrupted operations, and University Hospital Brno is a testing and treatment location for the coronavirus. And it's no coincidence that this was targeted during a public health crisis. In fact, extremely quickly after COVID hit the Czech Republic, it was under 2 weeks after the first case. It had a significant impact on the hospital. Data sharing was stopped. Some urgent operations had to be redirected or postponed. And this is not the only one. Health systems in Italy and Spain and a number of other countries have reported attempted ransomware attacks. One other to mention was in the US. On the 10th of March 2020, the Champaign-Urbana Public Health District in Illinois was hit by a ransomware attack. Now, the impact of this was mitigated because the hospital had shifted its records onto a cloud-based storage system, so it remained able to access them through the ransomware attack. However, it really does show that this is an uptick in cybercriminals explicitly targeting healthcare systems during the COVID pandemic in a way that we haven't necessarily seen before. And this is bringing to light a couple of considerations. Firstly, it's really emphasizing that health institutions have suffered from chronic underinvestment in cybersecurity for many years. This makes them extremely vulnerable targets. They hold lots of very sensitive data and are, of course, crucial in a public health crisis like we have at the moment. And secondly, it's a point about the morality of cybercrime. Now, cybercriminals often have a self-perception, or research suggests that they do, that they are entrepreneurs or businessmen, not so much a criminal on the street or that is conducting nefarious activities. And in general, cybercrime is often seen as a more remote kind of harm. However, now during the COVID pandemic, where we're seeing the targeting of healthcare institutions, we've seen commentators and critics suggesting that these kind of attacks should be likened to terrorism, and really emphasizing the possible fatalities linked directly to these attacks. So this brings me to a theme that we can really track across the activities of organized crime, but here I will be talking about the cybercriminal networks, which is that they are masters at exploiting vulnerability. And the COVID pandemic has created a number of increased vulnerabilities. So firstly, from the increased working from home that has been driven by the lockdown. This has a significant impact on the cybersecurity of companies and employers. Many employees don't have portable professional devices, therefore they use their own, which often have far less stringent controls on them and antivirus protections, and they're working off insecure personal Wi-Fi networks, all of which enable this entry point into company systems. Now, BEC scams, which stand for business email compromise scams, are a form of low-tech financial fraud in which spoofed emails from CEOs or suppliers or other trusted sources that are likely to request funds are sent to administrative staff to request money transfers. Now, these target individuals in their corporate roles, and therefore they tend to request quite large sums of money, as you would expect from corporate targets. Working from home context creates greater space for BEC scams because it's harder to check the pay orders. It's not that the boss is in the office next door. And typically these scams target less cyber aware and less cyber secure SMEs, which are also those that are most likely to be very hard hit by the shutdowns and the COVID pandemic. So this is really placing vulnerability upon vulnerability. And finally, with the increased reliance on remote banking and payment apps, this offers a new opportunity for hacking and phishing attempts, which we expect cybercriminals to take advantage of quite quickly. A further exploitation of increased vulnerability, which was mentioned by Elias, is the increase that has been tracked and is being tracked by international and national law enforcement and also civil society organizations working on countering child sexual exploitative material online. Countries as far removed as Sweden and Samoa have been reporting increased helpline calls and downloads for these kind of abuses. So firstly, we appear to have growing demand for child sexual exploitative material online. Europol have tracked a spike in the number of attempts to access websites featuring this material. Spain and Denmark are two countries that have reported such an increase. Also an increase in attempts to contact children online for the purpose of sexual exploitation. And on fora that are already known to law enforcement organizations, they have tracked an increase in conversations about exploiting children online and the new opportunities that COVID presents. So there's increased vulnerability of children during the COVID pandemic. Now, the COVID crisis has led to the closure of schools in roughly 194 countries around the world. This means that anywhere as much as 90% of the world's pupils are now at home. Often this means that they have greater unsupervised access to the internet. And also in certain poor and marginalized communities, parents who are facing vanishing livelihoods might be left with no other option but to live stream sexual abuse of their children for payment. This is already a reported trend in certain countries in Southeast Asia, for example, the Philippines, and sometimes online sexual exploitation is seen as doing less harm to children than physical exploitation. The FBI and a number of other national law enforcement regulators have been issuing specific warnings about the increased risk to children of online grooming during the COVID pandemic. A civil society organization called BARC, to try and test how quickly perpetrators were trying to contact children in this moment, posed as an 11-year-old girl online and opened some accounts, including some pictures of this girl. And within minutes, sexual predators were contacting the fake virtual identity on a range of different social media sites like Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok. So the speed of this is extremely concerning. And the combination of the growth in demand and the increased vulnerability seems to have sadly led to a spike in the production and download and streaming of child sexual exploitative material online. So Europol has reported a spike in the volume of these materials being posted on online forums and also on the number of downloads in peer-to-peer sharing networks. Spain reported a 25% increase of detected connections from which such material had been downloaded over peer-to-peer file sharing networks between the weeks starting the 17th and the 24th of March. This is an extremely significant spike and relatively close to the beginning of the pandemic. Finally, to compound all these risks, there is less policing of the online environment, partly, as Elias said, the national law enforcement agencies are having to divert certain resources to other activities, but also some of the private sector organizations that also play a role in monitoring the content online are scaling back on this. So, for example, Facebook reportedly sent a number of its moderators home on paid leave and is now relying much more than usual on its algorithms to manage human content. So while we have a spike in production and posting, we also have a decrease in the ability to detect and remove these materials. Finally, we are seeing, looking forward, we may see a displacement. So, for example, from the illicit economy, unemployment figures are estimated to be increasing already and to spiral further in the near future. And where there is no space in the licit economy, we see an increased move into the illicit economy, as also tracked by Elias, and unemployment can therefore act as a push factor for what we call deviant globalization, so this shift into the shadow economies. And where youth unemployment is particularly high, a number of those unemployed will have the necessary tech skills to move into cybercrime. And finally, as I noted earlier, the self-perceptions of cybercriminals can be quite different and see themselves as a way of getting past the system, surviving when on hard times. So this displacement from a moral perspective, from the licit to the illicit, is perhaps a smaller gap than across other crimes. Finally, we may start to see a displacement from some other forms of organized crime. So organized criminals may shift more of their activities online as they react to the restrictions imposed by responses to the COVID pandemic. One example that we have already been tracking is that law enforcement agencies in El Salvador report that the extortion gangs, so Las Maras and the other criminal gangs that survive predominantly off extortion, which is where they take a percentage of the profits of small businesses in exchange for protection, cannot conduct their extortion activities because many of these businesses have been closed down temporarily as part of the COVID response. And it is much harder for them to travel and collect the extortion payments. So local law enforcement are starting to track a displacement into other forms of crime already. This has included an increased shift into drugs trafficking, but law enforcement predict it could also be an increase into cybercrime as criminals identify that this is a form of crime that can carry on. Turning finally to responses. So in the face of increases in certain elements of cybercrime that are predicted to continue, what do we do? So firstly, to echo again what Elias was stressing as a very important point of responses is cross-border cooperation. Now, this is key in all forms of transnational organized crime, but in cybercrime, arguably, it is perhaps even more key because borders are just irrelevant to the perpetrators and to how these crimes are deployed. However, unfortunately, we're starting to see a rejection of globalization, a rise of populism, a turning inwards of countries, and as Elias said, a freezing of many international cooperation mechanisms. This is a significant concern, given that we're seeing a rise in cybercrime and a perceived decrease in our ability to respond to it. Further, 98% of cyber attacks are believed to use social engineering, i.e. deception of victims in order to work. So sensitization of the public is absolutely key, both during and after the COVID pandemic, because it really is human error that is being exploited in these forms of crime. And finally, investment in cybersecurity is extremely important, not just in the traditional areas of nation systems that are seen as highly sensitive, such as military or intelligence, but also in other systems, including the health systems, which are currently being the victims of this attack and don't really have the appropriate cybersecurity in place to defend themselves. So it's a complicated and evolving picture of how cybercrime is responding to COVID. Unsurprisingly, it's responding extremely quickly, it's adapting, it's exploiting the new opportunities that develop, and I look forward to discussing more in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Lucia, for this so insightful presentation. You managed to touch upon so many issues in such little time. I think it has become evident to all our attendees that cybercrime is a major threat, both for public infrastructure, but also for corporations. And it is corporations that will be addressed by our next speaker, Mrs. Gemma Iolfi from the Basel Institute on Governance. Because we will shift, so to say, a little bit from typical transnational organized crime like cybercrime or trafficking and take a closer look to the business world and the challenges that the business world, that multinationals or small and medium enterprises are facing nowadays. So Gemma will be addressing the challenges in the banking sector and also the challenges for corporations throughout the pandemic and also post-COVID. Having said that, I would like to give you the floor, Gemma.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much. And also thank you to the other two speakers who have covered much of the ground that, or some of the ground that I was going to cover, so that makes life a little easier, and I appreciate that very much. And thank you very much to everybody who's on the Zoom tool today, and welcome. I'm going to talk a little bit about the effect of the COVID crisis has had on compliance. This is a very broad topic. I'm only going to touch on a couple of points. And as we've already heard, we're in a time of great uncertainty. It's a unique moment, I think. And in times of great uncertainty, one of the most common indicators that we see used to illustrate this uncertainty is the gold price. This graph shows the price of gold in Switzerland since the lockdown, which was put in place in Switzerland around the 22nd of March, where we saw then a massive increase in the price of gold, which has continued to climb up until this finished on last Friday, this graph. But the price has hit, as we know, record levels. So since time immemorial, investing in gold has always been used to hedge risks. And even if we see a total economic collapse around the globe, many investors still clearly believe that gold will be the commodity that will still hold value. I'm just using this as a proxy to illustrate the degree of economic upheaval, which for compliance officers and compliance functions in business indicates a time of challenges and difficulties, and also for uncertainty, which never makes for smooth business in normal circumstances, and now it's even more exacerbated by working from home and other conditions that we've heard about earlier on. So looking first at compliance in the context of the financial industry and the threats and risks of money laundering, before moving on to other industries and some of the developments that we've seen here from the Basel Institute's perspective. Certainly, as it's been said a few times now, that criminal activity appears to have decreased in many countries as a result of the crisis in certain areas. But on the other hand, it's increased, as we've heard now, so well explained by Lucia and by Ilias, the criminal opportunists who have stepped up, moved in to take and exploit the opportunities that they've seen and adapting to new circumstances. So as I say, these are challenges for compliance, but at the same time in the financial industry, they haven't been delaying in trying to identify what the changes are and to try and help and support compliance functions in the financial institutions. So the Financial Action Task Force issued a report on the 4th of May on COVID-19 related money laundering and terrorist financing. So they pretty quickly pulled together examples from around the world. The Financial Action Task Force is, of course, the international standard setter for governments and the financial industry worldwide in the topics of money laundering, anti-money laundering and terrorist financing. It monitors the implementation of those standards on an ongoing basis. So I think it'll be very interesting to see, as we've all said in our presentation so far, that these are still early days. So it'll be interesting to see how this develops over time and how they monitor and how they respond, and whether they come up with more detailed typologies than they have so far in this report. Money laundering is, of course, the processing of illicit funds that have been derived from criminal activity and that are aimed to disguise their illegal origin. In many countries, any crime that generates proceeds, whether it's procurement fraud or an online scam that we've all heard about now, which uses the financial system to divert or transfer those funds, this constitutes money laundering. The FATF report describes how criminal activity has been perpetrated and is ongoing during this crisis. It's in a fairly short form, so is read quite quickly. The fraud threats that we've heard about as well in the previous presentations are ones that we've also read about in the media. These include impersonating public officials, hospital officials who claim a relative is sick and requires payment for treatment, asking then the victims to disclose their financial data. Where governments are already dispersing funds and tax relief payments to individuals and to businesses are also avenues that are seen by criminals as ways to infiltrate and take over those payments. Counterfeiting, that we've all heard about, unfortunately, a lot in the news in the last few weeks and couple of months. Online scams with prepayments and requests for credit card details, payments in advance, large payments in advance is the other thing that we've heard about, to deliver goods. Either they might be ineffective, they might be counterfeit, or there might be no delivery whatsoever. It's a pure scam. So there's been a lot of activity around that. Quite amazing how quickly that took off. Fake charities, that's something that often happens in times of humanitarian disasters and in times of great need. So fake charities being set up and then fundraising scams to get people to donate when in fact there's nothing behind it other than a criminal. And we've also seen fraudulent investment scams. So claims that companies have found the cure, have found the antibody tests, or the whatever else is being sought by governments and healthcare professionals, and then inviting investments into great opportunities when in fact those are not real. We've heard a lot about the cybercrime elements, so I won't repeat those, but they're also outlined in this report and are worth a look at because of the new forms of it that we just heard about. So looking at the FATF's assessment of the risks, this is just written in shorthand, but basically they're looking at sorts of crimes and money laundering issues that have always been there, but are maybe becoming a bit more to the fore because of the crisis. So criminals looking to bypass customer due diligence processes, ways of that would normally be the gateways that block them because of challenges in internal controls. Maybe some banks and financial institutions have got weak systems caused by people having to work from home. And then criminals coming in to see whether they can take advantage of that. As we've heard, online crime has been on the increase. Financial services that are conducted online and moving virtual assets to conceal illicit funds. Some criminals have taken the chance to do that too. Clearly, as I've said, the governments of many countries are offering enormous stimulus packages, insolvency schemes, and these afford opportunities for natural and legal persons to conceal and launder funds. And then what we're also seeing is quite an interesting removal of funds in terms of either liquidating holdings, because markets are very volatile. And so people remove or sell their holdings and move them into other forms of investments. But they may also cash out and then move into, as we just mentioned just now, gold. And that can be a way to shift and launder proceeds in the future when that money is perhaps returned to the financial systems in future. Clearly, we've also all heard about the misappropriation of aid, emergency funding, and so on, as being trying to be diverted through different measures. Procurement processes are also very vulnerable. There's been a lot of discussion amongst donors and procurement companies and so on about the procedures being avoided or shortened processes and the huge risk that this places upon financial institutions that are involved in those processes, but also companies. Looking at a couple of countries that are having offers of huge amounts of donor aid in forms and terms that they've never had to deal with before presents huge challenges as to how they're going to manage and operate those funds in future. So criminals and terrorists taking advantage of the situation, being very quick to adapt. The extent to which this will persist and whether there are ways to shut them down appears still to be an ongoing discussion, and we'll see how that evolves. As Ilyas said, a lot of this is still early days, so we're still in the process, I think, of evaluating how this is going to play out. Of course, the regulators are seeking to respond. So the risks that are being raised need a response that's proportionate and also enables banks to service the requirements of law-abiding customers. Small businesses in particular, as we know, are very much in difficult situations, and some of them are even in dire straits. But what's quite interesting, I think, when you look at these advisories and guidance documents that are being issued, so financial institutions are being encouraged or even told to maintain their risk appetite and reprioritize, and to look at how their anti-money laundering programs can be adapted. But the expectation is very much that things should return to business as usual as quickly as possible. Standards shouldn't be allowed to slip, and in terms of the risks that have been identified, there shouldn't be a stepping away from those. And so these all present huge challenges for compliance officers who are perhaps working from home or in difficult circumstances, to make sure that they maintain those standards that are still being expected of them by the regulators. So some of the changes also provide opportunities, again, perhaps for criminals to slip through. In Switzerland, for example, new business relationships that have been entered into before July of this year, the period for verifying due diligence has been extended from 30 days to 90 days, where the identification documents' authenticity has not yet been confirmed. There's also some greater flexibility about allowing customers to use accounts in an early stage, so that they can make sure that the ordinary course of business is not interrupted, so that if there's a limitation on the number of particular documents that have been provided, and assuming that certain standards have still been met, and the risk-based assessment is carried out, there can be some flexibility there. So it's on a case-by-case basis, and relaxation of the rules doesn't mean that the rules don't apply. So again, here the banks and financial institutions are being expected to operate their risk-based approach very vigorously, which is quite challenging given the circumstances, and also not necessarily knowing what will be acceptable if things turn out not to be so great further down the line. So hindsight's always a wonderful thing. So let's see how this turns out in future. In talking to some compliance officers about what they are doing and what they should be doing, I think the general consensus is to document everything very thoroughly when there's any deviation from what would look like standard and normal practice, so that later on, if justifications need to be given, the arguments and the reasoning behind all those decisions can be identified relatively easily. The UK Financial Conduct Authority has also issued guidance, and they've given quite a lot of detail as to what would be examples of exceptional verification processes for know your customer and such like. So I'm sure all this is very helpful, but as I say, it is hedged around with the advice and guidance that says don't change your risk appetite, don't change certain things that you've been doing, and make sure you cover your most serious risks. So that makes things quite challenging, I think, in reality. Looking at it from the other side, if you like, looking at how the regulators and supervisors and so on are having to cope with their obligations under the law and under the regulations. So looking at the impact of COVID on their anti-money laundering regimes, clearly working from home is an issue even for regulators, and access to files and secure systems has been perhaps problematic in some jurisdictions. On-site inspections, which are often a very important part of anti-money laundering and terrorist financing checks and so on by supervisory bodies, clearly affected by the lockdowns and so on, and purely a lack of staff due to illness and other family obligations and so on affect supervisors just as it does the private sector. I think the other two speakers have also already mentioned that international cooperation has been affected, including for law enforcement relating to money laundering and so on. So mutual legal assistance and so on is not going through as fast as it normally would do, and its normal circumstances, it's often very slow. So that's also problematic. Clearly, policy and regulation reform are put on hold in many places, and that can have an effect later on in terms of access to funds and how countries might be rated by the Financial Action Task Force in future evaluations. So this is the Basel Institute on a sunny day, which is today, I have to say, but the picture wasn't taken today. In talking to our private sector clients and those that come to us and look for advice and to discuss their situations, it's been quite interesting to hear the range of issues in terms of governance and compliance problems and questions that have come up. We've certainly heard from a pharmaceutical company that has had a huge increase in demands for humanitarian aid from governments around the world. And humanitarian aid would have particular approaches under their internal rules, but because of the sheer volume of requests, they've had to put a team of lawyers onto it and trying to sort out those that are genuine and those that are not, and how to field that and still fulfill their obligations and their desire to make sure that they can do as much as they can. We've heard about a lot of challenges to due diligence processes and how those can be overcome, and a lot of interest in our open intelligence tool, and companies wanting to use that because it can be used from anywhere and can perhaps reduce the need for additional on-site visits in some cases. I don't know if, Dimitris, you're trying to give me a sign to stop because we're over time. It's okay for the moment? All right. Small and medium-sized companies, as we know, are more susceptible to the economic pressures that we're currently seeing. The likelihood is that many SMEs will suffer heavily as a result of the economic recessions and hardships. It's interesting to note that the UK government has offering free services to small and medium-sized enterprises to improve and develop anti-corruption compliance. And we've seen an uptake in some of those services and those offers. Whilst in lockdown, there's sometimes companies can't do a great deal, but they can try to look ahead and to position themselves to be in a good position for when the COVID crisis hopefully comes to an end and lockdown lifts and businesses can resume. And to be attractive to customers, large customers, SMEs are looking to have, some of them are looking ahead and trying to make more robust improvements to their compliance and anti-corruption programs. In looking at the bigger companies and what's come out, I think one of the examples that we've seen has been the state interest and support for Lufthansa. And clearly the money is needed, as the company has said, for their future viability. And at the same time, the company needs to restructure, it needs to reduce jobs, it needs to look at how it can face the future. So it feels like it's a bit between the devil and the deep blue sea. They want the money, we need the government support, said the CEO, but we do not need government management. So they want the nice part, but they don't want the interference. The political component could be a delay to getting things done, and how long that will last and what that will mean. It's just one example of one industry that if it accepts funds on a great scale and then potential government interference, what will that mean? Also for compliance people in other industries who want to deal with state-owned enterprises as they might become or might be perceived to be, offers some challenges too, as we all know. Yesterday I saw a headline that said Indonesian government is planning to inject $8.6 billion, US dollars that is, for bailout for 12 state companies in countries where there are already challenges and weak governance and issues around massive corruption risks. The notion that $8.6 billion will be deployed properly within those state-owned organizations and state firms does raise questions and is problematic. There's plenty of guidance out there that has long pre-existed COVID-19, such as issued by the OECD on these topics. And it's to be hoped that at least some of those points would be picked up and applied. But in times of urgency and shortcuts, I think the risks are even greater. So I think that from a compliance perspective, these developments are quite dramatic and quite far-reaching. Finally, just looking ahead, post-COVID, we all know about washing our hands and doing the right thing and social distancing and so on. And that's taken from a Swiss poster issued by the government, and then somebody who thinks that maybe we should return to government interference in a big way has done a similar poster suggesting that Karl Marx might be the solution. I'm certainly not saying that that is the solution, but it's interesting to see that state aid and the EU approach has been very much focused on that. The new industrial strategy, as they're calling it, for a globally competitive green and digital Europe might still involve quite high levels of state intervention or state support. It'll be interesting to see how the response to those challenges, competitive green and digital Europe, will involve perhaps more state support than we've seen so far, which, as I say, creates more challenges, I think, for compliance than we've seen perhaps more recently. I'll stop there because we're way over time, I see, but thank you very much.
Okay, now I guess that now you can all listen to me, right, Gemma? Can you? Yeah, I've got you. Perfect. During your presentation, my laptop ran out of juice, so I had to switch to my mobile phone. It's part of the crisis. I think that today's, first of all, I will have to reserve my speech and my presentation for another webinar because we have run out of time. But I think for good reasons, because I would have addressed corruption issues in times of COVID and post-COVID, and I think that more or less Gemma did this as well, because she did address actually procurement issues and urgency procurement issues. We've been seeing all those direct awards happening all over the world to cover the needs of health management and so on. And also Gemma addressed state aid, which is so important and so corruption relevant. I think that today's three presentations were very nice in terms of flow, because we kicked off with Elias, and trafficking is more a social issue, right? So it touches upon human rights and democracy very strongly. Then Lucia addressed cybercrime, which is a more technical IT issue. And then we moved on to something which is more financial, business-wise. But actually, all those three pillars, let's say, of possible criminal activity or possible criminal response, that being through governments or through corporations in terms of corporate governance, are interconnected, actually. Because I was thinking when I was listening to Gemma, if you don't have strong banks and a strong private sector which complies with anti-corruption and anti-money laundering rules, then you won't be able, post-COVID, to finance the economy. And if you don't have a strong economy, then I doubt that corporations will be able to dedicate the needed resources, for example, to fight cybercrime. And the same goes for governments. So economy is closely interlinked with democracy, after all. So if we don't make those resources available for governments to fight crime by improving, let's say, law enforcement mechanisms or international cooperation, then both economies and democracies will be brought down to pieces post-COVID, and we will have to face a major crisis. So I think that it is important to keep this nexus in mind. It's also clear to me, and it must be clear to all of us, that we are entering terra incognita, so unknown territory. And this is why I would like to really comment our distinguished speakers today, because they have addressed issues for the first time, more or less. So all this is unknown to governments, it's unknown to criminal policymakers, it is unknown to academia. And I would say the extent of the impact of the COVID pandemic on crime, organized crime, financial crime, corruption, integrity, ethics, compliance issues remains to be seen if we're going to be able to disseminate evidence, an evidence-based approach to anything that we have discussed today. So unfortunately, we are running out of time. Fortunately enough, there were not that many questions coming in the chat box. So there is nothing else to say in terms of a Q&A session. I would like to give the floor to our panelists in terms, if they would like to make a closing remark. Is there anything that you would like to contribute, Elias or Gemma or Lucia? Okay, if not, because we have just reached our time limit with Zoom, I would like to thank you all for taking the time, first of all, our speakers, for being with us today and for sharing your expertise and your insights into your industries and into your fields of law or corporate governance issues with our attendees. I would like to thank particularly the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies of the University of London for facilitating this webinar. Hopefully this is the first of other webinars to follow, so this is just a starting point. I do believe that the dialogue in the business community, in the criminal or anti-criminal community is just starting right now, so there will be a lot of discussion that will happen in the following months. Thank you all for your time, and I do wish you well. Stay safe, stay healthy, and in good spirits. And I do hope to meet again with you in the future and further discuss in more detail the topics that you addressed today. So have a good evening, and thank you very much for being with us. Bye-bye.